Hello and good evening. My name is Annalisa Campos, and I will be reporting and analyzing the relationship between the colonists of America and Great Britain. Additionally, I will take a look at the actions of an organization called the Sons of Liberty and designate which actions can be seen as a protest or a riot. Now let's start off with some background history about the colonists and the British. Great Britain, a struggling European nation, was the last to enter the imperialist game and was desperate to gain more power, land, and wealth. What better place to make that happen than the new land discovered all the way in the Americas? At the time, Great Britain was struggling financially, so they planned on using a system of private enterprise within the colonies in order to reach that goal. They heavily romanced the idea of new possibilities in traveling and colonizing this land. Therefore, many struggling British individuals looking for a fresh start and to escape from religious persecution took this chance to go to America. Many upper-class individuals seeking more power and riches also took the bait and sailed to this new land. Once colonizing started moving along, which was met with some conflict from the Native Americans already inhabiting that land, the 13 colonies began to form and eventually subdivided into the northern and southern colonies. It's important to note that the conflicts brewing between the colonists and Great Britain did not happen in a couple of months, but all throughout the beginning of the colonization to the breaking point of war. It all started with solitary neglect, or autonomy. Great Britain did not have the funds to directly control every part of the colonies, since they were so far away. Therefore, in the beginning, they took a hands-off approach and let the colonies govern themselves. This ultimately led to greater political independence from the mother country and somewhat of an ego. Even if they did not control everything in the colonies still provided new markets and land to Great Britain since they were still connected to the crown. Eventually, the colonists began demanding to have the same rights and liberties of the Englishmen all the way back in Great Britain. This problem escalated after the crown started to notice that the colonies were not following English rule. Even so, the conflict truly started picking up the pace when Great Britain decided that the colonists, as an extension of the crown, should help pay off the debt that the British accumulated from the French and Indian War. A series of acts would soon be administered, and the colonies, having never had the attention of its mother country, would soon begin to rebel against these newfound taxes. It all started with the Navigation Acts in 1651, which made it illegal for colonists to make their own goods. This forced them to be dependent solely on Britain and therefore support them financially. Then the Molasses Act came, which placed a 7% tax on molasses imported from other countries. This was to stop colonists from buying the cheaper French molasses and to influence them to start buying Britain's molasses instead. In response to this act, many individuals performed acts of civil disobedience, such as smuggling French products, which ended up displeasing Britain. Several other acts went into place, such as the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act. These acts upset the colonists, but there was no big uproar quite yet. Things escalated when Parliament passed the Stamp Act, an act that required colonists to pay taxes of printed materials. There were many complaints the colonists presented in regards to the Stamp Act, but the biggest one was that they were being taxed without representation. Eventually, a group of people who met at Samuel Adams' tavern began to discuss these taxes. This group of people would later be known as the Sons of Liberty, a radical, unofficial organization of individuals who protested against the Stamp Act and other acts soon to be implemented. This group included famous names such as Samuel Adams, John Adams, and Paul Revere. Their forms of protest involved intimidating the stamp collector by burning an effigy representing the collector himself and burning down their houses. Additionally, they tarred and feathered these individuals and painted Hillsborough paint on their door, which was a mixture of feces and urine. Eventually, the act was repealed, but the Sons of Liberty protested other acts as well, such as the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Act. In response to the Townshend Act, the Sons of Liberty, colonists, and Daughters of Liberty boycotted British goods. Essentially, the Townshend Act were repealed as well, all except for the tax on tea, which was left just as a symbol of Parliament's power. Also, as a form of protest, the Sons of Liberty would loot and burn down British ships. Things got heated when the tensions from the Tea Act exploded, and the Sons of Liberty boarded a tea ship and dumped $2 million worth of tea into the harbor. This would later be known as the infamous Boston Tea Party. Once the colonists in Boston were punished by the coercive acts or intolerable acts, unrest spread across all the colonies, and the spirit of revolution was not so far away anymore. Now that I have gone over the acts the colonists were taking action against, now I will decide which acts, taken by the Sons of Liberty, were protest or riot. First off, what is protest, and how is it different from rioting? Well, generally, the word protest has a more positive connotation than the word riot. Some may define a protest as a public expression of objection. When I think protest, the image of a peaceful march or powerful speeches fills my mind. In comparison, a riot can be defined as a violent disturbance of peace by a large group of individuals. In regards to a riot, images of vandalism and violence plague my mind. These definitions have been integrated into our morals and thoughts over time, and right now they are being used to define what is going on in the current world, when in reality, not everything is that cut and dry. In this case, for purposes of defining, I will classify protesting as justified and rioting as not. Smuggling and bribing may be against the law, but it is truly just one's persuasive skills to achieve a goal, which does not involve anything physical besides money and trade. By doing this, the colonists are stating that they do not want to be taxed. Therefore, I say this action can be defined more as a protest than a riot, even though it can lead to legal consequences. In regards to being a secret organization that plots against the government, I would say plotting insinuates that the action has not been done yet. This means no actions have truly taken place. I think of this as just an idea floating around in someone's mind, but not having done anything based on that thought. The colonists can plot to not pay taxes or raid a ship, but that does not mean they have done it yet. Therefore, I would define this action as a protest. When it comes to intimidation tactics, I would define these as rioting. The Sons of Liberty tried to intimidate stamp collectors by showing them their guns and threatening them. Although they may not physically harm the person being threatened, they still hold a weapon that could accidentally make those empty threats real. With tensions high and threats could turn into actual harm, and that is why I would define this action as a riot. The use of Hillsborough paint, which would be considered rioting because it is a form of destruction of property. Also, not only will the paint cause damage, but it will worsen the cleanliness of the house. Remember, back then, the lack of hygiene during that time caused many to become sick and in many cases led to death. Moving on to a more complex action, effigies, in my opinion, are a form of protest. They are violent in concept, but not in action. Effigies are like a form of dark art and emotion, and protesting does consist of expressing those emotions through some form of art as well. Burning effigies of tax collectors may have been a bit intense, but is still only a statement. These next two actions, burying people alive and tarring and feathering, are both strong forms of rioting. These acts of violence certainly did harm to the victim, and hot tar would leave many burns that led to deadly infections. Although it was meant mainly to embarrass that specific individual, in many cases it caused serious injury depending on the heat of the tar. Burning people alive was ultimately aimed to kill the target, so that is definitely an act of riot as well. Petitioning the government is certainly an act of protest. It is calling for reform on paper and is a legal form of protest. The Declaration of Rights and Grievances was a petition against the Stamp Act and practically stated the objections of the colonists. In stark comparison, burning down a house is completely vandalism, and therefore an act of rioting. Pamphlets, such as Thomas Paine's Common Sense, is definitely a form of peaceful protest. Writing is a good way to get one's point across without using physical force, and once again represents the feelings and thoughts of the author. One can express their sincerity through words, and thousands of others can read those thoughts and feelings and reflect on them as well. Boycotting is also a form of protest. Refusing to buy goods such as tea, molasses, or clothing is all in one's freedom of choice. It does not directly cause violence, and it was a very powerful way to object to British policies. Even so, boycotting British goods was not enough for the Sons of Liberty. Eventually, during the Boston Tea Party, the colonists took over a tea ship and dumped $2 million worth of tea into the harbor. Since that is destruction of property, I would say this is an act of riot. The same applies to burning stranded ships, mainly because the colonists would scare off the British on the ships and then burn their property as a message towards the tea tax. Ultimately, many of these actions led to one another, and therefore riot led to riot, and vice versa. When it comes to the Sons of Liberty, there is a lot of gray area on whether their actions are justified or not. Even so, it is our job to reflect on the history and look at current events with a deeper understanding and broader perspective. Alright, thanks for listening to my report and have a nice night.